things that if they don't value it, if they don't respect it, then maybe that is not the space for you. Too often we force ourselves into spaces that don't accept us for who we are.
Welcome to Teachers Ed Podcast, a place where the best and brightest in education come to be inspired, to learn, to connect, and grow. And as always, I want to start by thanking our sponsor, Be Well Teacher Box, a gift box to help educators focus on their mental wellness. If you use code TeachersEd, you can get $7 off. If you haven't, please like, subscribe, and leave a review. This will help me get in front of more educators that are just like you. So let's get started. Today's guest is Charles Williams. He is a dedicated educator with nearly 2 decades of experience. He has made impactful contributions in various capacities, including being a teacher, assistant principal, and a principal within the K-12 sector. His unwavering commitment to fostering equity is highlighted through his advocacy work with the equity offices of both the City of Chicago and Chicago Public Schools. Charles extends his passion for promoting inclusive narratives as the host of the Counter Narrative podcast and as a former co-host of the educational show Inside the Principal's Office. In addition to his educational endeavors, Charles is the founder of a consulting firm where he thrives as a best-selling author and is celebrated for his compelling workshops and motivational keynote speeches. I can tell you firsthand, I have heard Charles present, I have heard him speak. He is dynamic. He is a man. When I say a man for the people, I mean educators, leaders, counselors, whoever in the educational space. If you have not heard Charles, I would recommend finding a way to hear him, whether it's at your school or at a conference. Charles, thank you for joining me. I am happy to have you on the Teachers Ed podcast. How are you doing today?
Man, Edward, I'm gonna have to ask you to just do my intro all the time. Like that, you could be the hype man because I'm sitting there. I was like, that's me. Like that's amazing. No, thank you so much for allowing me to be in this space. I'm honored to have been able to meet you. I remember sharing space together. I think the first time we actually connected was Vegas, and so I was like, man, this guy's doing some amazing things. So those words coming from you mean a whole lot, and I cannot wait for this conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited, man. I appreciate you taking time. I know you're busy. I know you got a lot of other things going on. So let's jump right in. I know one of the big things that I wanted to get you on and talking about, because I've been in a lot of educational spaces and workplace wellness is something that is just struggling. And I know I've seen the work you've done. I know that you are strong in that space. So I really would just kind of like to hear some of your thoughts about workplace wellness. And I know there's teachers that listen that are tired right now. They're burnt out. I want to open the floor up to kind of let you give an introduction to where you are in that space, and then we'll kind of go through from there.
Yeah, so I completely understand the concept of being burnt out, right? You're tired, you're overworked, you're overwhelmed. For us, right, at the time of this recording, spring break is in a few days. So, I see it around the building, and not just with staff, right, but even with the students. And so I think one of the things, though, that I've really focused on, right, there's a lot of people talking about wellness and workplace mental well-being and things like that. But what I've noticed is that a majority of these individuals come from a space of being reactive, right? Like the idea of somebody saying, well, I need to take a mental health day. And there's nothing wrong with us having mental health days, but the fact is, that's not going to fix the problem. Like, you don't get to take a day off and then come back. At least for me as a school leader, if I took a day off and then came back, I'm going to have twice as many emails and other issues. Like, they didn't go away. So my hope is, and the work that I've started to do is, instead of being reactive to spaces, is how can we be proactive? How can we avoid burnout to begin with? And I know sometimes people are like, that's not possible. And it is. It absolutely is, if we understand. And so one of the things I was just doing this past Saturday was hosting a workshop for school leaders across Chicago. And one of the things that we're talking about then is to say, well, just like the dashboard warning lights on your car. Right? I mean, Ed, how many times have you been driving and that empty fuel light comes on and you're like, nah, I know my car. I'm good for another 10 miles. We ignore it, right? And we just keep pushing through.
Push it sometimes.
But we do the same things to ourselves. right? That low pressure tire comes on, the oil light comes on, whatever it is that comes on, and we're like, nah, we're good. We can keep going. And before we know it, right, the car's in the shop broken down and it has to take a few days to get repaired. But you know what? If we were to pay attention prior to, right, there's that little sticker that says, hey, your oil needs to be changed at this time. If we pay attention to that and make sure that we are taking care of things, guess what? My car's not going to break down because the oil went bad, because I took care of it prior to. And so I think that is the space that I want us to get into. One aspect of that is being proactive. But I think the other part of that, and I know I'm saying a lot here, but I'm sure we'll dive in, is really reframing what it means to do this work. I think that we have created, we complain about these toxic spaces that we're in, but I think a lot of it stems from the things that we have created. So if we've created these and we've allowed these things to occur, because I believe in that concept of like what you permit, you promote, then it is
Mm.
our job to break that. And that's one of those spaces I'm pushing back. I'm telling my school leaders to tell the district leaders, no, because what's going to happen if we all collectively like, no, we're not okay with this. We need you to take, so every time you put something on my plate, I need you to take something off, right? They're not going to fire everyone, and if they do, well, I mean, I don't want to challenge that. I want to see what would. But my guess is we could create a movement where we change what it means to be school leaders. We could change what it means to be teachers. We could change this toxic space that has been created because we have we've made ourselves martyrs to this field, right? And there's nothing wrong with being passionate and dedicated, but there's no reason that we need to be martyrs.
Yeah, and hearing what you're saying, one of the things that I've shared with educators is, I'm 41. Like when we were younger, it's like it was a badge of honor to just overwork yourself. Like, oh, I worked six, like the grind culture that, how they would
Yeah.
call it now. But what I'm hearing with you is really drawing boundaries as educator, but also it starts with the leadership. And I think one of the challenges that I have seen, and this is not even mental wellness, it's just schools in general, is we've learned from the leaders in front of us. So right now you have a lot of principals that learn from principals who learn from principals who learn from principals. What advice would you give? Because right now there's a lot of people that are transitioning into leadership because leadership is retiring, leadership is going to
True.
other fields. What advice would you give someone that is a newer school leader, whether it's a principal, assistant principal, dean, whatever that position is? What advice would you give them for them to be a catalyst of change to create a safe environment that's not toxic for the educators in their building?
So I think one of the first things that people should do is understand your boundaries, right? And when we talk about boundaries, for me, when you define a boundary, it means understanding and not just knowing, but also then communicating. Like, what are your capacities? And that typically stems from understanding your core values, your beliefs, your purpose, your why, whatever term you want to use. But to say, these are my boundaries, right? And to say, I think that we're afraid of that, right? Because if we create a boundary, kind of like you and I were talking about prior to jumping on here, if I say, look, this is my boundary, and then something comes along that challenges that boundary, what's going to be important is how do I respond to that? Because the moment that I say, okay, well, here's my boundary, but I guess I'll let this thing slide, guess what? It's no longer a boundary, right? And so I believe that people will respect you way more if they understand, hey, I know Ed believes in these things, right? And when challenges present themselves, when these conflicts have presented themselves that challenge those boundaries, he said he has stood firm. Man, I respect this dude for that. Right. But so oftentimes we're worried about that it's going to make us look weak. We're worried about the fear of the missed opportunities, whatever it might be. And we let those boundaries down and we expand them a little and then we expand them a little more and a little more and a little more. And before we know it, we're like, we don't even know where those boundary lines. Right. And so I think if you're a new leader, come in and understand that. Right. And recognize the boundaries of your staff. Recognize as long as they're, I guess understandable, not that's not even the word I'm looking for, as long as they're feasible, right? Recognizing those boundaries and the capacities and saying, hey, if I'm willing to say I have boundaries, then I must recognize that my staff have boundaries. It's not fair for me to have these expectations if I'm leaving the building early because I got to take care of my family, to say, hey, staff, I got to leave early to take care of my family, but you know what, I need you to then pick up my slack. Like, no, if that's something that collectively we have families and understand, guess what, As a school leader, I'm going to set this boundary for all of us. Look, you know what? 3:30, we're done. Whatever it might be. And I'm just giving an example.
Yeah.
But that is, I think, one of those first places. And I get it as a new leader because I used to be in that space. It is hard to do that because you're so worried about, right, this culture that has been built. And I will tell you, Ed, that my youngest baby, she's 20 years old. Right? I've spent the last decade sitting in the principal's seat, a little over a decade. Do you know how much time of her life I have missed? Right? And
Mhm.
that's my youngest. My wife and I, we have 5 girls. How much time I have missed because I didn't know how to set boundaries, because I was chasing after this dream, because I was trying to do all of this. And guess what? I finally obtained it, but I can't get that time back.
Yep.
Right? And so I have to understand now, look, I'm setting boundaries. You know what? She graduates next month with her an associate's. And I was like, I'm taking off. I'm not worried about it. I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you, right? Because one of my values is my family. I'm going to be out. Don't bother me. I'm not taking my work. I'm not doing calls. I'm there for my baby. But I think I'm comfortable enough doing it now because I've been in this space. But I'm telling you, as a new leader, any new leaders watching this, you too can do this. And I will say this, and I know this is probably one of the hardest things, that if they don't value it, if they don't respect it, then maybe that is not the space for you. Too often we force ourselves into spaces that don't accept us for who we are and value us for what we're bringing to the table. If that is not the space, then find a new space.
And I love it. And if there's one thing that I think teachers can stand on right now is that you're not replaceable. Like I am someone that tells teachers like we all are replaceable in a sense. Like I'm the executive director of school, and someday someone will have my job. There's no denying that. But as an educator, like yes, your job is great. That is for some people their purpose and it's their passion. But ultimately, being a father, being a mother, being a friend, being a brother, like
Absolutely.
that is something that there's nothing that should overtake that. And one of the things I had to learn was, and I heard someone else say this, and it stuck with me, is don't give your job the best and give your family the rest. Like our
Mm-hmm.
families deserve better than just getting the crumbs on the plate at the end of the day. And that is something that I think a lot of educators struggle with. And I see this on TikTok. And maybe you can answer this because I know what someone listening to this is going to say. I see it in my comments when I post videos about this type of stuff. There's a thing, teacher guilt. Like, yes, it's easy to say draw the boundaries, but like when I draw them and I don't get things done, I feel guilty. The educator that's listening that has that teacher's guilt, like, what would you say to him or her?
So I think one of the first, I think something that immediately came to mind is the concept of a trade-off, right? And the guilt's not going to go away. Guilt is a normal feeling. So I think first and foremost, recognize that it's not going to go anywhere, right? You own it, embrace it, but understand this, like, where's the guilt coming from? Like there's this concept of a trade-off that every time you say yes to something, you have to say no to something else, right? And so
Hold
if
on.
you're going to,
Charles, say it one more time because people need to understand that because you only have so much bandwidth in a day and in life. Say that one
only
more
so
time.
much.
I don't want people to miss that.
Yeah. Every time you say yes to one thing, right, you have to say no to something else. And so you have to ask yourself if that extra project, if that extra task, if it's night school, whatever it might be, that you're like, hey, I value my students, right? So I want to do these things and I get it because you're passionate and you're dedicated and I commend you for that. But every time you say yes, what are you saying no to? Are you saying, no, hon, I can't be home and spend time with you tonight? No, to my child, I can't come home and help you with homework because I'm at school helping my students with their homework. Right? Are you saying yes to working on a Saturday program, but you're telling no to your friends and your family, those who have supported you throughout all of this? Hey, no, I can't be with you. And if you can really sit in that space and be like, I'm okay with that, then that's fine. But more often than not, that guilt that you have, guess what? As you said earlier, we are replaceable, but not. Because if you say no to working after school, guess what? There's going to be somebody else who can do that. Somebody else who can do that trade-off. Right. And so don't sit there in your guilt. You are not obligated to do this work. And again, I say that coming from a space because I get it.
Yeah.
So many times I've said yes to things, but guess what? That guilt was gone from that side. But guess what? Now I have guilt from the other side. So you're not going to
Yep.
get rid of guilt by doing that. So just ask yourself, what guilt do I want? What guilt can I live with? what guilt is going to go away eventually, right? Because like we've talked about, our jobs are temporary, our families are not. So which guilt are you okay with? What is that trade-off? What are you willing to say yes to? What are you willing to say no to?
Yeah, and I think as a teacher, it's like don't be so driven to raise everyone else's kids that you're missing out on raising your own.
Yeah,
It's like
absolutely.
we spend all of this energy, and I understand it. Like that's our job. Like our job is to give these kids the best that we have while we're there, but also making sure that we're not giving our classroom, our school the best, and then you're missing your child's recital, you're missing basketball, or you're just home from and when you're home. And then I think that's the other thing is when you draw those boundaries, making sure that you're able to be present with the people at home. You're not at home at the dinner table like I got these 30 assignments that I got to grade while your child needs help with their homework, or while they don't even need help with homework, while you can just sit and spend some time with them. Like
Yeah.
we don't want to look bad. There's a saying, I don't remember exactly, but something like your child will not remember all those overtime hours you work, but they will remember the time that you missed at their events or at whatever. And I
Yeah.
think that guilt is something I hear so often from teachers, and I totally understand it because you want to be the best at what you do. Like you're called to be a teacher and you want to do that, but you're also called to be a parent or a friend. Even if you do, I think there's a guilt even for people that don't have kids. It's like even if you don't have kids, it doesn't mean that your work should still revolve around teaching because you just don't have a kid or a family, or you're not married. Like you still have a life and family and people that love you and you can spend some time with. Like don't allow school to absorb all that time. There
And
was
I just want to also say, because I think a lot of times when we have these conversations, people envision or they talk or they think it's like it's an all or nothing. And by no means am I saying that. When we say about boundaries, like, so for example, one of the things that for the longest time, I said I would tell my wife because she'd be so upset. Every day you come home, you're working, you're working, you're working, you go to school, you're working as a school administrator, you're coming home, you got the hustle grind going on. So even I said, look, Tuesdays and Thursdays, those are the only days, right? When I come home, Tuesdays and Thursdays are the only days that I grind it out, right? Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays are date nights, right? Like, so it's okay to find some type of balance, but then that was my boundary. If somebody was to come along and say, hey, can you record something on Monday, or can you do this session on a Wednesday, I'd be like, nah, you got to fit it into a Tuesday or a Thursday. And that if that doesn't work for you, then I'm sorry, then it's not going to work for me either, because I've promised this other time to my family, right? And so I just wanted to say that because it's a weird thing that we do in ed. It's like either or. It's very rare that we say an and, right? It's
yes,
like it's okay to have a little bit of both, right? But again, once you set those boundaries, stand firm in them. And I know it's one of the hardest things.
yeah, and so there was a school that I was at, and just hearing the things you're saying. There was a school I was at in Wisconsin earlier. Shout out to Reed Elementary in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And when I was there, I was so impressed with the principal because she was having conversations. There was an all staff meeting before we did a professional development, and she was telling them, like, listen, stop sending me emails at 7 p.m., at 8 p.m. Like, it was interesting to see because she was like, I'm drawing boundaries for myself, but sometimes I think in leadership, we also have to draw the boundaries for our staff. Like, do not. And I think I want to say their district has like some sort of toggle on their systems where at certain times they can't do certain things. And maybe I misheard that, but she was dead set. Like, after this time, I don't want you emailing. I don't want you in the school, on the website, none of that stuff. Like, that is your time to spend however you want, but it can't be spent doing education. I was very impressed because I'm like, I think that's what some administrators need to do because
Mhm.
people are going to burn themselves out regardless. Like, I got to get it done. I got to get it done. But like, no, you are more effective when you're rested and in a good mood than you are when you just burn your wick all the way to the end. So when I was there, I was just so impressed with the culture she was building because she was not only drawing boundaries for herself, but she was drawing boundaries for the staff. Like, after this point, please, I don't want to see any emails. I don't want to see any of this because I need you guys to take that time for your family. And it was noticeable how the staff looked up to her, how they respected her. And I think that type of leadership goes a long way. So I do want to shout Principal Eisenschenk. You're ever
Thank God.
listening to it, shout out to her. She was absolutely incredible. So One of the next question I would ask in this is, you were talking about really being proactive. What are some of the ways? I know some of the things that I like to do, but I would love to hear from you. What are some of the ways you would encourage educators to be proactive in taking care of themselves? I know, the not responding to emails. Like, what are some of the things that you would recommend or that you've heard of some educators doing that really help them? Because I think teachers hear it and we push it, and especially from COVID, we've been pushing it. But like, what are some actionable steps that someone listening can take and start to execute to really be proactive with their wellness?
So, I mean, I think, you know, everyone has different needs, right? So I think part of that is understanding what are your needs. But I think in being proactive, it's understanding, well, what are my stressors, right? So when we talk about stress, you usually have two types of stress. You have eustress, right, which is this idea of saying, sometimes we talk about like, hey, like we got a deadline, right? And it pushes me towards, it gives me that oomph that I need, right? So stress in small doses isn't always a bad thing. Well, what happens is that if we don't manage that stress accordingly, and it turns into distress, right? And
Mm.
that's when things become an issue. So and it could be little things. I think when we think about burnout, like it's not just one thing. It wasn't like I had a fight with a colleague and all of a sudden I'm burnt out. Like it wasn't that fight. Maybe that was the catalyst. It was the tipping point. But there were a bunch of other little things that led up to that. And so I think for me, it's understanding what are your triggers, what are your stressors, right? And recognizing those things. And so when they do pop up, then asking yourself. So this is part of the workshop that I do. One, identifying those stressors, but then also, what is it that I need, right? So one of the things that I loved, about beautiful weather is my wife and I, we go on these walks. We have a trail near our house, and so we'll go for a 3 mile walk, right? It passes this little man-made lake, right? You're in nature, and it's just the two of us, right? And we sometimes we aren't talking. Sometimes we talk about whatever it might be. She's an educator, so sometimes it's work related, but whatever it might be. But that's our thing. Other people like to go for a run. I promise you, if she and I went for a run, we'd probably be more stressed than prior to. Like,
You sound like
but
me with my wife. Like, I ain't want
yeah,
to go.
like
I walk all day with you.
exactly, right. So I think it's identifying for me, it's identifying those two pieces. What are the things that stress me out? And so how can I try to avoid those things? Or at least if I know it's unavoidable, right? So for example, maybe it's sitting in traffic, right? Chicago has one of the worst traffic spaces, right? I had a friend who was like, hey, I'm only going to be like 20 minutes away from you. I think I'll swing down and see you for lunch. And I was like, yeah,
Nope,
no, that's not how traffic works here.
not
Like
at all.
it's 30 minutes to go 5 miles.
You're still an hour and a half away.
Exactly. Like, so if I know that traffic is one of my stressors, right, then my thing is, all right, I'm not going to be able to avoid it, but what can I do? Maybe it's listening to a type of music while I'm sitting in traffic, right? Maybe it's listening to an audiobook. Maybe it's saying, okay, once I get to work, I'm going to take a quick, 10-minute walk around the building, just through the hallways to decompress and to center myself. Whatever it might be, but it's understanding what is that stressor, and then what is that thing that I can do to alleviate that stress? Because so often, right, if traffic is a stressor, right, I don't leave my house on time. So now I'm in traffic. I'm running late. My stress is building. I get to work. I don't give my time to decompress, right? I'm running into a meeting or something. And it's building and it's building. So it's recognizing what is it that's going to cause me damage, and being very, very, very intentional about how am I going to alleviate that, because you can't avoid stress, but you can be very intentional about how you respond to it. And so without giving very, very specifics, right, because everybody has their own thing, I think those two things, if we do that, then that's important. And doing so, I will add this piece in, doing so in a healthy way. To be honest, a few weeks ago, I had COVID, right? And so I was on my medicine. I was taking things. It hit me pretty hard. So all that week, I didn't have a single drink at all because I was on my medicine. So I was like, you know what? Let me just try something here, right? So that following week, I still wasn't feeling so well. I went a whole nother 2 weeks. But I said, you know what? Let me just try. And for I think probably about a month now, I haven't had anything, right? And I've noticed this change. And one of the things people talk about are how do we how do we help respond healthily, right? Because a lot of times we resort to unhealthy practices because it temporarily relieves that stress, but it creates other issues. And so this is just once again one of those promises, dedications to my family and others. Like, I'm going to try to be as healthy as possible and live as long as I possibly can. And it's been a little easier than I imagined. But my good friend Mike Earnshaw, he is an ambassador for Athletic Brewing, which is like a non-alcoholic beer, right? And I was like, all right, I'll
Very
give it a
good, by
shot.
the way. If
Very
very
good.
good, by the way.
So it's there are options. I just wanted to throw that out there because I know people may joke like, yeah, I had a stressful day, so I'm gonna go, indulge in whatever item it might be, and just not I'm not dissing anybody who does those things. Just be cautious and mindful that whatever you're doing actually helps you, and it's not just a band-aid.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that. So I'm closing in on 10 months without a sip of alcohol. And I wasn't drinking a ton prior. So that's why I know about the athletic brewing, because the few times I've had a non-alcoholic beer, I've had theirs, and it is outstanding. But one of the things that I just learned was I track my sleep. I'm big on tracking. I'm just a data nerd in general. Like data, everything I do is in a school is data driven. If there's data, I want to know about it because that's how you can make, in my opinion, how you can make your best decisions. So I track my sleep, and what I learned was even with just a glass of wine. So my resting, and I'm not going to get too into this because we'll end up losing people's attention, but my resting heart rate is 52 beats per minute. I have a glass of wine. My resting heart rate is 68 beats per minute that night. And my sleep, I may feel like I sleep better, but I wake up and my body was working so hard to get that wine out of it. So getting alcohol out of my life was probably one of the best decisions that I've ever made. And that's coming from someone who used to have a glass of wine every night, sometimes two, sometimes three, shoot, maybe a bottle or two down a night. And it was my way of decompressing. And then I started to realize, like, man, I feel worse the next day. And then I show up to work and I don't feel rested, which then made my fuse a little shorter with students, with staff members, with parents. And then ultimately, once I just completely cut out of my life, is I just sleep better. And
Right.
ultimately, when it's all said and done, burnout is not something that people do intentionally. It's something that happens on accident because, like you said, we're not intentional with noticing what those warning lights are on our dashboard and
Mhm.
taking little steps. Now, it's okay if someone's like, let me have a glass of wine or let me have a beer. Like, I would never tell someone to just cut that out if that's something that they enjoy doing. But, you know, can you limit it a little more? Or can you do it on a Saturday so then you're recovering on a Sunday and not doing it on a Tuesday when you have a long day at work the Wednesday? And I think those are things that people don't realize how much it affects them because you have a few drinks, you sleep very well. You're like, wow, I was knocked out. Yes, but your body was trying to process. And there's a lot of science behind that. And I don't want to go too deep into that, but that was one thing for me that I noticed. When I cut that out, my sleep has just improved so much, which ultimately has just made me better in everything else that I do because I feel just a little bit more rested. So that's one of the things I know. Man, we're gonna be getting ready to close up. I know,
Yeah.
man, I got to get you back on because we got some leadership conversations that we got to have. But this one just ran up to the limit, which is good because I know in the times I've spent in education, this is the topic that teachers and educators are struggling with the most. It's like they feel overwhelmed, they feel burnt out, they're tired, they have 10 extra duties, but I think some of the tips that you shared as far as being intentional, drawing boundaries, like in not even just drawing them, standing on them. Like it's one thing to
Mhm.
draw. People are like, well, I've drawn them. And then when people cross them, you don't tell them to get back. It's like, no, I've drawn them. This is the boundary that I'm drawing. The answer is no. So I think those are some valuable tips. What is the final thing that you would share with the educators listening, that it could be a leader educator, whoever it is that just is struggling still? Like you've given them some tips, you've given them different things that they can do in their buildings, different things they can do outside. But what is the final thing? If you could say anything to teachers out there that are listening that are having a hard time, what's the last thing you would say to them as we get ready to close out?
So, one of the things that I say oftentimes when I get this question, like, what is the last thing that you want to say? Is that it's this, right? There are so many different things in this world that you can be. The most important thing is to be true to you. Know who you are, know your purpose, know your values, know your boundaries, like we talked about, and just be true to you. And as tired as you are, as struggling as you might be, that at the end of the day, if you sit in those spaces, you're going to feel a whole lot better at the end of the day because you know where you stood. You stood firm in those spaces. And I would tell you that you will find yourself eventually. Maybe it's not happening right now. Maybe it's not tomorrow. Maybe it's not even at the end of the school year, but eventually you will find yourself in a space where you can truly be you. And when that happens, it will make all the difference. But you will never ever get there if you don't know who you are because you will not know where you need to be. So again, just be true to you.
I love it. Thank you, Charles, for coming on. For those that are listening, Charles, can you let the audience know where they can find you on social media? And what I would tell anyone that is listening, your staff is struggling. Charles is the person that can help you. I have seen his work. I will not put my stamp of approval on just anyone. He is dynamic. If you are looking for any support in these spaces, please connect with Charles. Charles, can you let them know where they can find you on social media, website, any plugs that you want to give? I want to give you that opportunity to do that as we wrap up.
Yeah, no, man, I appreciate it. So the easiest way to find me on social media, my handle is at underscore CW Consulting. You can find me all over the place. Twitter's probably the space where I'm most active, but you can definitely find me. If you connect with me, I will definitely connect back with you. You shoot me a message, I will respond. You got the website, cwconsultingservice.com. Everything is linked on Twitter and all the other spaces. They're all linked together. YouTube pages. I even have an Instagram and a TikTok. I don't know what the heck to do with those. I'm tapping into my children to help me with that one. But yeah, and of course, I think we mentioned, there's a podcast, there's a book out there. So, just I'm trying to add as much value as I can to this space, right? And so if you can get that passively by following me and just reading some of the stuff, great. If you, as I said, there's something you need that I can support you. Let me know. I'd be more than happy to help as long as I can, and I want to make sure, right, that I'm adding value. So, Ed, again, just thank you so much for giving me this space. I appreciate you.
Yeah, and thank you for coming on. And he definitely does add value. I'll make sure that his information is in the description of this episode. Charles, man, it's an honor to have you on here. I appreciate you for being on here. But man, I just appreciate you. I have been in educational space for 18 years. I've been to so many conferences. I've been around so many, people that are consultants. And I can say there's a lot of people out there that don't have the true heart for education that you do. So man, I just appreciate your like true dedication to the craft and making sure that, you're trying to, like you said, you're trying to bring value to a space that needs value more than it ever has. So thank you for coming on. Again, if you guys haven't, please like, subscribe. Make sure you go give Charles a follow. Check out the things that he's doing. Again, those will be in the bio of this episode. And we appreciate you all for tuning in. And we will see you next Sunday.